Why is everything going to collapse? Be warned, this video won't make you feel better. It's meant for those who wish to know what to expect. I won't merely state that we're in trouble. Instead, I'm going to summarize what I now know of abrupt climate change and how it will play out for all of us. But mostly, I'll explain why it's completely unavoidable. By now, you're probably aware we're in the midst of a biodiversity collapse. We are experiencing the sixth mass extinction at a rate greater than when dinosaurs were wiped out. When you take out 50% of all terrestrial wildlife in 50 years, there's going to be some repercussions. Regarding oceans, the loss of 90% of whales and sharks has unprecedented impact on phytoplankton. Whales have a boost effect on both phytoplankton and krill, while sharks are the apex predators that regulate the entire marine food chain. Without them, this chain will topple from its base, which happens to be phytoplankton. What is phytoplankton? It's microvegetation that absorbs CO2 and produces oxygen. It's estimated that over 50% of our oxygen originates from oceans. Yet another problem is that reduced phytoplankton means less CO2 absorption. The oceans can no longer purify the air in a world where pollution is increasing. For phytoplankton, the loss of whales and sharks aren't the only threats. There's also plastic waste, acidification, dead zones, oil spills, noise pollution that prevents mammals from singing and mating. And for the rest of marine life, it is estimated that, and recent findings would show this to be extremely optimistic, our oceans will be empty by 2048. If this happens, or if we go anywhere near it, we are entirely screwed. I will conclude by talking about coral reefs, which migrate from south to north and are undergoing massive bleaching in tropical regions, an absolute disaster for local biodiversity. Only, tropical coral is not particularly adaptable to temperate climates, and it mostly just throws a big fat wrench in the engine of temperate zones' biodiversity. There's also the exchanges of warm and cold bodies of water that are changing at a staggering speed because of the melting of glaciers, which has a direct impact on major ocean currents like the Gulf Stream. If this stops, and some scientists now refer to it as nearly certain, that's virtually all temperate climates that stand to be affected. With less heat comes less evaporation and less clouds and less rainfall. We don't just have oceans, there's land biodiversity as well, and this one happens to be in complete agony. On the topic of agriculture alone, you need only know that nearly 95% of our soil's life has been lost in the past 60 years. You can blame this on the use of pesticides, fungicides, and herbicides, on the reasoning that fields must be plowed, on a production-based approach that inherently disrespects the life of soil, resulting in diseased vegetables, designed to withstand pesticides, but sorely lacking in genetic diversity, which threatens their resilience. As far as terrestrial mammals go, we've encroached upon their turf so badly that they struggle to survive, or have no other choice but to live near humans. A good example is the wolf. We know that each wolf covers immense territory, but we insist on leaving them increasingly little space. We then wonder why they attack sheep. Is our response to concede land? Of course not. We kill them. In France alone, they are killed at a rate of 40 per year in a population of only 300. Brilliant. Turning now to humanity's voracious and growing appetite for energy. Our society is terminally addicted to energy, and most of our political and economic decisions perpetuate the misconception that energy sources are somehow infinite. So, about energy. We mainly use oil, coal, and gas to produce energy. All three currently represent 92% of the world's energy production. As for the remaining 8%, 4 comes from nuclear, 3 from dams, and 1 from what we call renewable energy. Today, we're literally betting the farm on these last 3, but they're just a drop in the bucket as far as global production goes. And they're not exactly the holy grail. The energy production itself doesn't lead to emissions, but it kicks in with a vengeance come storage time. Batteries. Storage is required for such forms of energy unless you intend on using your solar-powered lights in broad daylight and shutting them off when the sun's out. Would you? Probably not. The most carbon-stingy energies today are nuclear and hydroelectric dams, but this raises a whole bunch of other major concerns. Radioactive waste and risks of meltdowns for nuclear, environmental devastation, and habitat destruction for dams. In short, there is no such thing as clean mass energy production. It just doesn't exist. And in terms of oil production, oil wells are seeing their returns on investment plummet fast. It's defined as the number of barrels of oil you produce for every barrel spent on extraction. In the 1920s, the ratio was 100 to 1. Today, it is dangerously close to 10 to 1, or even as poor as 4 to 1 in some cases. In short, we're consuming more and more oil in order to extract and produce less. Oil has never been so costly and inefficient. In fact, this peak oil you've heard so much about was in 2006. We haven't produced more in a year ever since. Experts believe that this will remain through 2020, at which time we will observe a steady decline. By the way, there is peak gas as well, and this happened in 2010. Peak coal will hit by 2020. And I sincerely doubt that we have the necessary resources to make a full switch to renewable energies. Speaking of which, the production of metal can't last forever either, and demand for metal grows with every passing day, largely thanks to electronics, but very much across all industries. The problem being that most metals simply isn't recyclable. Less than a single % of rare metals in our phones gets recycled and reused. Here's an example. 95% of titanium we use isn't in the form of a metal. It's used as a universal white pigment. It's therefore in all our titanium white paints. Think we'll start sanding our white walls to recycle that titanium? No, it's lost. It's the same with the 3% of tungsten alloy present in some car doors. It will never be recycled back into pure tungsten. This doesn't just apply to metals, which theoretically could be recycled almost endlessly. Plastic can be recycled no more than 7 times. After that, it loses its properties. In short, a circular economy is a pipe dream. It can't be done. The problem with rare metals? Mines are bearing less minerals, which means we need to dig more for the same yield. Once again, we're seeing a declining return on investment. I won't list out all the metal peaks we can expect, but rest assured, metal shortages are coming. All this to say that given the context, building solar panels and generators using all these metals in order to offset other energy sources is misguided. But hey, there's still going to be an economist who will state otherwise, and the dream might catch on. Now, on to animal farming. Breeding and feeding animals consumes large amounts of food and water. Instead, we could be using this to feed our own selves, or to offset our heavy reliance on production fields. Farm animals also produce methane, a greenhouse gas considered to be 30 times more potent than CO2. Livestock consumes an astronomical amount of water, which contributes to deforestation in the Amazon and overfishing, as fish byproducts are often used to feed pigs. As for slaughterhouses, I won't dare dig into the ethics, though I certainly could. Energy production, metals, transportation, animal farming, all of them pollute, and as such, they all contribute to the increase in global temperatures. If all countries signed on to the COP21 agreement make good on their promises, which isn't a given, we could expect global temperatures to rise by 3.5 degrees by 2100. 3.5 might not seem like all that much, but trust me, it's disastrous. Are you sitting down? Here's what that number represents. The Arctic melts completely, oceans expand, sea levels rise. Florida no longer exists. Miami and New York are gone. Bangladesh and a bunch of Pacific islands get wiped out. The glaciers of Tibet melt, so come summer, the 3 major rivers of Asia, including the Ganges, run dry. Major problems befall densely populated areas. Shanghai is located at the gates of a desert. Rainfall turns rare across the Mediterranean basin. Crop yields drop, forcing millions to migrate north, where resources are insufficient to accommodate exploding populations. Oh, and for those who might say, relax, that's in 2100, do you honestly believe that everything will run smoothly up until December 31, 2099? If the 3.5 degree scenario plays out, and it is apparently rather optimistic according to many, Miami and New York are actually gone by 2050. Among other scenarios, one is labeled with a 10% chance of occurring, which would see a 6-degree global increase. In this case, expect total annihilation of mankind. And if you feel 10% is low enough to rest easy, I dare you to hop on a plane that has a 10% chance of crashing. You'd probably think twice. What about that 2-degree increase, you might ask? Well, we've already released enough carbon to raise global temperatures by 1.25 degrees, which only gives us 0.75 degrees worth of wiggle room to meet that target. I'll make this short. To achieve that, we would have to divide our current standard of living by 6 immediately. This isn't what we're doing, nor is it in the plans of any of our governments. Let's move on to more immaterial things, though central to the argument over systemic collapse: the human collective. What better way to address this than to discuss our financial system? The crisis of 2008 showed us that risky bets taken by a few banks were all it took to trigger a global financial crisis. This is very much due to the interconnected nature of our society. Reckless miscalculations on Wall Street can cause job losses in Spain. All financial experts agree the next major crisis will strike within 5 years. My limited knowledge of this field make me fear this as well. A population that is already suffering from economic inequality is more exposed than ever before. Economic inequality is more glaring and it's only expected to rise. This increases the risk of revolt. Given everything I've described so far, major societal unrest could greatly complicate things. I've given you a broad view of the systemic risks that we will be facing. I will now explain why, given the context, a global collapse is completely unavoidable. Here are the reasons. Humanity doesn't perceive these dangers as truly imminent, but rather as hypothetical and seemingly distant, and it will refuse to fully prepare for them or make the necessary changes to avert catastrophe. Also, actions being taken by our governments are not aiming at true emission reduction. We continue to feed and maintain a system that is slowly but surely killing us. Big change will not happen from the ground up. Globally, we are not sufficiently coordinated. Here's a simple example. Someone decides to avoid taking the plane as an environmental gesture. His buddy becomes a minimalist, his sister goes vegan, and her cousin decides to consume organic only. Great. The gestures are individually relevant, but collectively, they lose their importance. The vegan sister will go meatless while others don't. The action gets drowned out. The cousin cuts on heating, but others still have it on full blast. Gesture lost. To be effective, the changes need to be applied across the board. Furthermore, it might be fairly feasible for groups of friends to coordinate their actions, but not so on a self-managed global basis. Change from the ground up is, in my view, unattainable. Now imagine for a moment if a government dared impose drastic, sweeping measures to limit the height of the fall prior to collapse. It would be besieged by its angry population and should probably expect to be thrown out come election time. People would never ever agree to something as extreme as a 6-fold reduction in living standards. Regardless of the how, a majority of people would never renege on their comforts, and that's without counting those that don't have what Westerners call basic comforts. How do you figure they'd react to being told to scale back considering many don't even have running water? The Indian president said ahead of COP21, "All you Westerners and your kind words, I will take global warming into consideration the day my people enjoy your standards of living." The fight against inequality is a pressing issue, and it is up to wealthy countries to lead by example. Sadly, they won't do it because nothing fundamentally drives them to it, and chances are, they wouldn't even know how to divide their standard of living by 6. At the political level, the fix is in. The most glaring evidence being virtually any environmental advisor within government ranks. They are ultimately powerless. They must operate within the system and as such bend to its every whim. Our governments, which reflect our society, do not account for ecology when planning. Nothing will change on that front either. In short, a change from the ground up is a big stretch and policy change is just about impossible. It's a deadlock with no solution in sight. Hence, a collapse is inevitable. So what do, you might ask? We continue to live. We prepare for blissful simplicity. We aim for zero waste, reduction, and reuse. We strive to inflict the least possible harm around us. We nurture all things local. We grow our own vegetables. We learn new skills. We build communities towards sharing, independence, resilience. But above all, and most importantly, we must not forget to love each other.